So essentially, there's a couple problems with this. So the first thing I want to point out is that we know from the literature how much protein we want to have on a regular basis to maximize protein synthesis and minimize protein oxidation. So that comes, and this includes, I think, like 2 standard deviations from the actual value that was obtained, or at least 1 standard deviation from the value that's actually obtained to give it a little wiggle room to make sure you weren't right at that border. But it's like 0.82 grams per pound per day. Now, this is for if you're obese, you have a lot of body fat, the value would be, the calculation would be a little bit different. But it would be like 1 gram per pound of lean body mass is what you would shoot for. But for this particular circumstance, from the research, that's the value that we're actually looking at. And so what's the importance of this? The first piece is that you don't want to be using protein as an energy source because there's problems with that. First thing is, if you're going to use protein as an energy source, you're going to likely convert it to glucose, and you're going to upregulate some of the I guess, adaptive or the stress hormones, including glucagon. And then in the process of converting protein to glucose, or not necessarily protein, but amino acids into glucose, you're going to generate ammonia. And so the ammonia itself is toxic to the body. We do have systems that are capable of detoxifying it, aka the urea cycle. But in detoxifying ammonia, there's an energetic cost. That requires ATP to be used to detoxify the ammonia. And then the other thing is to take an amino acid and convert it to glucose, you also need to you need to use ATP. So overall, you have a net negative, or you have a net positive effect of ATP. But it's you don't generate as much ATP as you would with glucose specifically. And then at the same time, the ATP is being pulled specifically from the liver. The liver is basically under one of the major sites of gluconeogenesis. So the liver is sacrificing its ATP pool to detoxify ammonia and also to create glucose from amino acids when you have an excess of protein. And this is especially in the case of a lower carbohydrate diet. So that's problem number 1. The other problem that happens when you have way too much protein in your diet is that you have an extreme amount of satiety. So you're just not hungry. Now, as we just talked about at length, just using protein to essentially wipe out your hunger so that you can eat less and therefore lose weight, will it work? Probably. However, does it come at a cost? Yes, very likely that it comes at a cost, because now you're number 1 in a low carbohydrate diet, which we know has negative effects on both sex steroids and also has a negative effect on thyroid hormones. So there's problems in and of itself there. And then in the long term, being on these low calorie diets will have negative impacts on metabolism overall, and you'll see adaptive down regulation of metabolism. So it's essentially, this is just another strategy to lower your caloric intake by drastically increasing your satiety and overeating protein. The last cost and I've talked about this, I have a whole video on this on my YouTube channel, and then Jay and I have also directly talked about this together. But protein does, there's, I think, about 5% of protein makes it to the colon on a regular basis. And some of those amino acids can be converted into some pretty toxic metabolites inside the colon. So if you're drastically overeating protein, you're likely to get more of these metabolites in the colon. And then from that perspective, there's some negative effects that can happen from that. So some of them could be ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, P-cresol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like, I think the protein idea, I think at one point I even thought this as well throughout my own journey going through these different diets and whatnot, was that, protein is the only safe macronutrient, right? It won't make you fat. You can eat as much as you want of it. It'll keep you satiated. Most animal protein sources are quite nutrient dense. So how could you go wrong with protein? But there actually is detriments to having excessive amounts of protein. And personally, when I was doing keto, I was eating 200, 300 grams of protein a day. And essentially what I was doing was I was just making up for my lack of carbs with really high protein intake. And that there is a huge negative effect of that on the body in multiple ways, as I just mentioned. So overall, do you need to have enough protein in your diet? Yes, for certain reasons, but just excessively increasing it to to increase your satiety and lower your calories, there is actually negatives and drawbacks to it. So it's likely not the best strategy. Will you lose weight? Probably. But again, it's coming at the same way of you're just eating less overall because you're so full from all the chicken breast.
Yeah. And is losing weight in a short period of time the parameter to determine if something's working? We know that you can you can do a low calorie diet, you can fast, you can do whatever you want to lose weight in the short term. That doesn't mean it will stay off long term. And it doesn't mean it won't come at a cost. And if it does stay off long term, it means it's coming at an even bigger cost, which is everything we just described coming from the Herman Ponzer perspective and the constrained model of energy expenditure. Yeah. So kind of going back through a few things you mentioned, all good points. You mentioned that 0.82 grams per pound being the high end of what may be necessary as far as maximal protein, muscle protein synthesis and things like that. And, positive nitrogen balance. Normally we would say the 0.6 to 0.8 grams per pound of protein is totally adequate. That's normally the range we shoot for. I'll refer back to an episode where we talked about that and other macro ranges as well. And I'll also refer back to the studies from Menno Henselmans and articles discussing that. So what we're not talking about here is what is optimal for building muscle or protein needs, but rather increasing protein beyond those needs, as you were saying, to increase satiety and basically cause a low-calorie diet. All this is a low-calorie diet, and he also has, the diagram showing that fiber is really helpful as well. Water is really helpful as well. Anything that's going to increase satiety and help you eat less calories. And we just had this discussion from discussing Herman Ponzer's work, suggesting why that's not a good idea at all. It's the equivalent of just increasing your exercise by 1,000 calories a day on an ongoing basis. And look at all the costs that has. You see it very clearly in studies on animals. You see it in studies on humans. And you're creating this constant energy deficit, and that has to come from somewhere. Our bodies will conserve as much energy as possible when they're put into that starvation state. And that means it's a perfect recipe for low thyroid, low sex hormone production, and high stress hormones. And that is the other thing you were talking about is the involvement of needing to convert that protein to energy when you're eating a very high protein diet. And you were saying, it's not very efficient. We've referred to these studies. We talked about this quite a bit during the Nutrition with Judy episodes, because this was, she's coming from a carnivore perspective. So again, very high protein, although in her case, much lower on the carbs than I think Ted Naiman is specifically. But we talked about how in order to use that protein for energy, it's 30% less efficient than using glucose for energy. And because of that, our bodies don't favor that pathway. And instead you have to activate that pathway by being in a stress state, and that involves the activity of glucagon. We talked about the problems with the influence of something like glucagon on a long-term basis in the episodes with Rob Wolf, and how that depresses thyroid activity and is a stress hormone just like adrenaline and cortisol, and will therefore come at a major cost. And not only, I shouldn't say just suppresses thyroid activity, but suppresses or impairs the conversion of the inactive T4 to the active T3 thyroid hormone. So major negative effects there in terms of lowering the metabolic rate. And so that is one major issue with trying to use protein as a fuel. But then, of course, the other one is you're creating a low calorie state, you're displacing carbs and fats, and that's also going to drive stress and further depress our metabolism through all of the means that we've discussed here. And we've referenced in the past some studies looking at the protein to carbohydrate ratio, showing that decreases testosterone. Of course, that not being something that we would generally want to do. And you talked about the negative effect of ammonia as well as a product here. And then you also mentioned that in the intestinal side of things, that excess protein will also cause issues there. So quite a few areas where, that kind of demonstrate that protein is not just a free macronutrient. We just want to increase it, and that is the solution to health. It is a solution to weight loss, especially short-term weight loss, but that doesn't mean that it is a good solution for long-term health or long-term weight loss. So, I think that's my main thoughts there. I don't know if you have anything else you want to chime in with.
The only other thing I wanted to add that we didn't specifically mention, but I'm pretty sure protein intake over a certain level is also associated with higher amounts of cortisol. And I think I think we mentioned this at some point, it may have to do with upregulating the urea cycle to manage the ammonia and whatnot, the excess ammonia that's produced at super high protein intakes. So you have essentially, just looking at it on paper, increased glucagon levels, lower thyroid hormone levels, lower testosterone levels, increased cortisol levels, and then you're also likely going to be in a caloric deficit because it's just really hard to eat high amounts of calories when your diet has a large percentage of it as protein. There's some finer points that you could mention, but I don't, like, for example, like amino acids and mTOR and longevity and yada yada, but I think that's kind of besides the overall picture. And I want to reiterate here, like, if your goal is to lose weight and you don't care about the health effects and anything else, sure, slam protein and eat a really low calorie diet. And will you probably lose weight? Of course. The question is just, what state will you be in when you're done? And so I think it's really important to understand the context of like, what is your goal? What is your context? Are you trying to lose weight and then, like, in a sustainable fashion and not have a drastically negative effect on your hormonal profile when you're done doing that? Is that possible? Yes, that's 100% possible. Is there a way to do it without having to go on like a protein sparing modified fast where you just eat really high amounts of protein and relatively lower amounts of other macronutrients? Yeah, there's definitely a way to do it. So I think that's important to keep in mind. If it's rapid weight loss though, and you don't really care about your health, then yeah, you could probably lose weight really fast on a protein sparing modified fast type diet or really high protein, low calorie diet in general. So I'd want to make that clear because we're not arguing against that. It's definitely can have those effects. It's just there is a cost in the long term with that.
Yeah, it's the best way to lower your metabolic rate. If you want to have to continue to eat lower and lower calories to maintain your weight forever, while it comes at the cost of all of your other functions, perfect. That is the best way to do it. But obviously, we're suggesting that that's not a good idea for most people. And instead, there are much better solutions that increase your metabolic rate, increase the amount of energy going to all those other functions, and at the same time can, like, literally in the process of fixing that, reduces the amount of substrate going to body fat.